Death is an advisor. Would you teach me someday about peyote? I asked. He did not answer and, as he had done before, simply looked at me as if I were crazy. I had mentioned the topic to him, in casual conversation, various times already, and every time he frowned and shook his head. It was not an affirmative or a negative gesture, it was rather a gesture of despair and disbelief. He stood up abruptly. We had been sitting on the ground in front of his house. An almost imperceptible shake of his head was the invitation to follow him. We went into the desert chaparral in a southerly direction. He mentioned repeatedly as we walked that I had to be aware of the uselessness of my self-importance and of my personal history. Your friends, he said, turning to me abruptly. Those who have known you for a long time, you must leave them quickly. I thought he was crazy and his insistence was idiotic, but I did not say anything. He peered at me and began to laugh. After a long hike we came to a halt. I was about to sit down to rest but he told me to go some 20 yards away and talk to a batch of plants in a loud and clear voice. I felt ill at ease and apprehensive. His weird demands were more than I could bear and I told him once more that I could not speak to plants, because I felt ridiculous. His only comment was that my feeling of self-importance was immense. He seemed to have made a sudden decision and said that I should not try to talk to plants until I felt easy and natural about it. You want to learn about them and yet you don't want to do any work, he said accusingly. What are you trying to do? My explanation was that I wanted bona fide information about the uses of plants, thus I had asked him to be my informant. I had even offered to pay him for his time and trouble. You should take the money, I said. This way we both would feel better. I could then ask you anything I want to because you would be working for me and I would pay you for it. What do you think of that? He looked at me contemptuously and made an obscene sound with his mouth, making his lower lip and his tongue vibrate by exhaling with great force. That's what I think of it, he said and laughed hysterically at the look of utmost surprise that I must have had on my face. It was obvious to me that he was not a man I could easily contend with. In spite of his age, he was ebullient and unbelievably strong. I had had the idea that, being so old, he could have been the perfect informant for me. Old people, I had been led to believe, made the best informants because they were too feeble to do anything else except talk. Don Juan, on the other hand, was a miserable subject. I felt he was unmanageable and dangerous. The friend who had introduced us was right. He was an eccentric old Indian, and although he was not plastered out of his mind most of the time, as my friend had told me, he was worse yet, he was crazy. I again felt the terrible doubt and apprehension I had experienced before. I thought I had overcome that. In fact, I had had no trouble at all convincing myself that I wanted to visit him again. The idea had crept into my mind, however, that perhaps I was a bit crazy myself when I realized that I liked to be with him. His idea that my feeling of self-importance was an obstacle had really made an impact on me. But all that was apparently only an intellectual exercise on my part. The moment I was confronted with his odd behavior I began to experience apprehension and I wanted to leave. I said that I believed we were so different that there was no possibility of our getting along. One of us has to change, he said, staring at the ground. And you know who? He began humming a Mexican folk song and then lifted his head abruptly and looked at me. His eyes were fierce and burning. I wanted to look away or close my eyes, but to my utter amazement I could not break away from his gaze. He asked me to tell him what I had seen in his eyes. I said that I saw nothing, but he insisted that I had to voice what his eyes had made me feel aware of. I struggled to make him understand that the only thing his eyes made me aware of was my embarrassment, and that the way he was looking at me was very discomforting. He did not let go. He kept a steady stare. It was not an outright menacing or mean look, it was rather a mysterious but unpleasant gaze. He asked me if he reminded me of a bird. A bird? I exclaimed. He giggled like a child and moved his eyes away from me. Yes, he said softly. A bird, A very funny bird. He locked his gaze on me again and commanded me to remember. He said with an extraordinary conviction that he knew I had seen that look before. My feelings of the moment were that the old man provoked me, against my honest desire, every time he opened his mouth. I stared back at him in obvious defiance. Instead of getting angry, he began to laugh. He slapped his thigh and yelled as if he were riding a wild horse. Then he became serious and told me that it was of utmost importance that I stop fighting him and remember that funny bird he was talking about. "Look into my eyes," he said. His eyes were extraordinarily fierce. There was a feeling about them that actually reminded me of something, but I was not sure what it was. I pondered upon it for a moment and then I had a sudden realization. It was not the shape of his eyes nor the shape of his head, but some cold fierceness in his gaze that had reminded me of the look in the eyes of a falcon. At the very moment of that realization he was looking at me askew, and for an instant my mind experienced a total chaos. I thought I had seen a falcon's features instead of Don Juan's. The image was too fleeting and I was too upset to have paid more attention to it. In a very excited tone I told him that I could have sworn I had seen the features of a falcon on his face. He had another attack of laughter. "I have seen the look in the eyes of falcons. I used to hunt them when I was a boy, and in the opinion of my grandfather I was good. He had a Leghorn chicken farm and falcons were a menace to his business. Shooting them was not only functional but also right. I had forgotten until that moment that the fierceness of their eyes had haunted me for years, but it was so far in my past that I thought I had lost the memory of it. "I used to hunt falcons," I said. "I know it," Don Juan replied matter-of-factly. His tone carried such a certainty that I began to laugh. I thought he was a preposterous fellow. He had the gall to sound as if he knew I had hunted falcons. I felt supremely contemptuous of him. "Why do you get so angry?" he asked in a tone of genuine concern. I did not know why. He began to probe me in a very unusual manner. He asked me to look at him again and tell him about the very funny bird he reminded me of. I struggled against him and out of contempt said that there was nothing to talk about. Then I felt compelled to ask him why he had said he knew I used to hunt falcons. Instead of answering me he again commented on my behavior. He said I was a violent fellow that was capable of frothing at the mouth at the drop of a hat. I protested that that was not true. I had always had the idea I was rather congenial and easygoing. I said it was his fault for forcing me out of control with his unexpected words and actions. "Why the anger?" he asked. I took stock of my feelings and reactions. I really had no need to be angry with him. He again insisted that I should look into his eyes and tell him about the strange falcon. He had changed his wording. He had said before, "a very funny bird," then he substituted it with "strange falcon." The change in wording summed up a change in my own mood. I had suddenly become sad. He squinted his eyes until they were two slits and said in an overdramatic voice that he was seeing a very strange falcon. He repeated his statement 3 times as if he were actually seeing it there in front of him. "Don't you remember it?" he asked. I did not remember anything of the sort. "What's strange about the falcon?" I asked. "You must tell me that," he replied. I insisted that I had no way of knowing what he was referring to, therefore I could not tell him anything. "Don't fight me," he said. "Fight your sluggishness and remember." I seriously struggled for a moment to figure him out. It did not occur to me that I could just as well have tried to remember. "There was a time when you saw a lot of birds," he said as though cueing me. I told him that when I was a child I had lived on a farm and had hunted hundreds of birds. He said that if that was the case I should not have any difficulty remembering all the funny birds I had hunted. He looked at me with a question in his eyes, as if he had just given me the last clue. "I have hunted so many birds," I said, "that I can't recall anything about them." "This bird is special," he replied almost in a whisper. "This bird is a falcon." I became involved again in figuring out what he was driving at. Was he teasing me? Was he serious? After a long interval he urged me again to remember. I felt that it was useless for me to try to end his play. The only other thing I could do was to join him. "Are you talking about a falcon that I have hunted?" I asked. "Yes," he whispered with his eyes closed. "So this happened when I was a boy?" "Yes. But you said you're seeing a falcon in front of you now." "I am." "What are you trying to do to me?" "I'm trying to make you remember." "What?" "For heaven's sakes." "A falcon swift as light," he said, looking at me in the eyes. I felt my heart had stopped. "Now look at me," he said. But I did not. I heard his voice as a faint sound. Some stupendous recollection had taken me wholly. The white falcon. It all began with my grandfather's explosion of anger upon taking account of his young leghorn chickens. They had been disappearing in a steady and disconcerting manner. He personally organized and carried out a meticulous vigil, and after days of steady watching we finally saw a big white bird flying away with a young leghorn chicken in its claws. The bird was fast and apparently knew its route. It swooped down from behind some trees, grabbed the chicken and flew away through an opening between two branches. It happened so fast that my grandfather had hardly seen it, but I did, and I knew that it was indeed a falcon. My grandfather said that if that was the case it had to be an albino. We started a campaign against the albino falcon and twice I thought I had gotten it. It even dropped its prey, but it got away. It was too fast for me. It was also very intelligent. It never came back to hunt on my grandfather's farm. I would have forgotten about it had my grandfather not needled me to hunt the bird. For 2 months I chased the albino falcon all over the valley where I lived. I learned its habits and I could almost intuit its route of flight, yet its speed and the suddenness of its appearance would always baffle me. I could boast that I had prevented it from taking its prey, perhaps every time we had met, but I could never bag it. In the 2 months that I carried on the strange war against the albino falcon I came close to it only once. I had been chasing it all day and I was tired. I had sat down to rest and fell asleep under a tall eucalyptus tree. The sudden cry of a falcon woke me up. I opened my eyes without making any other movement and I saw a whitish bird perched in the highest branches of the eucalyptus tree. It was the albino falcon. The chase was over. It was going to be a difficult shot. I was lying on my back and the bird had its back turned to me. There was a sudden gust of wind and I used it to muffle the noise of lifting my .22 long rifle to take aim. I wanted to wait until the bird had turned or until it had begun to fly so I would not miss it. But the albino bird remained motionless. In order to take a better shot I would have needed to move and the falcon was too fast for that. I thought that my best alternative was to wait. And I did, a long, interminable time. Perhaps what affected me was the long wait, or perhaps it was the loneliness of the spot where the bird and I were. I suddenly felt a chill up my spine and in an unprecedented action I stood up and left. I did not even look to see if the bird had flown away. I never attached any significance to my final act with the albino falcon. However, it was terribly strange that I did not shoot it. I had shot dozens of falcons before. On the farm where I grew up, shooting birds or hunting any kind of animal was a matter of course. Don Juan listened attentively as I told him the story of the albino falcon. "How did you know about the white falcon?" I asked when I had finished. "I saw it," he replied. "Where?" "Right here in front of you." I was not in an argumentative mood anymore. "What does all this mean?" I asked. He said that a white bird like that was an omen, and that not shooting it down was the only right thing to do. "Your death gave you a little warning," he said with a mysterious tone. "It always comes as a chill." "What are you talking about?" I said nervously. He really made me nervous with his spooky talk. "You know a lot about birds," he said. "You've killed too many of them. You know how to wait. You have waited patiently for hours. I know that. I am seeing it." His words caused a great turmoil in me. I thought that what annoyed me the most about him was his certainty. I could not stand his dogmatic assuredness about issues in my own life that I was not sure of myself. One became engulfed in my feelings of dejection, and I did not see him leaning over me until he actually had whispered something in my ear. I did not understand at first, and he repeated it. He told me to turn around casually and look at a boulder to my left. He said that my death was there staring at me, and if I turned when he signaled me I might be capable of seeing it. He signaled me with his eyes. I turned and I thought I saw a nickering movement over the boulder. A chill ran through my body, the muscles of my abdomen contracted involuntarily and I experienced a jolt, a spasm. After a moment I regained my composure and I explained away the sensation of seeing the flickering shadow as an optical illusion caused by turning my head so abruptly. "Death is our eternal companion," Don Juan said with a most serious air. "It is always to our left, at an arm's length. It was watching you when you were watching the White Falcon, it whispered in your ear and you felt its chill, as you felt it today. It has always been watching you. It always will until the day it taps you." He extended his arm and touched me lightly on the shoulder, and at the same time he made a deep clicking sound with his tongue. The effect was devastating. I almost got sick to my stomach. "You're the boy who stalked game and waited patiently, as death waits. You know very well that death is to our left, the same way you were to the left of the White Falcon." His words had the strange power to plunge me into an unwarranted terror. My only defense was my compulsion to commit to writing everything he said. "How can anyone feel so important when we know that death is stalking us?" he asked. I had the feeling my answer was not really needed. I could not have said anything anyway. A new mood had possessed me. "The thing to do when you're impatient," he proceeded, "is to turn to your left and ask advice from your death. An immense amount of pettiness is dropped if your death makes a gesture to you, or if you catch a glimpse of it, or if you just have the feeling that your companion is there watching you." He leaned over again and whispered in my ear that if I turned to my left suddenly, upon seeing his signal, I could again see my death on the boulder. His eyes gave me an almost imperceptible signal, but I did not dare to look. I told him that I believed him and that he did not have to press the issue any further, because I was terrified. He had one of his roaring belly laughs. He replied that the issue of our death was never pressed far enough. And I argued that it would be meaningless for me to dwell upon my death, since such a thought would only bring discomfort and fear. "You're full of crap," he exclaimed. "Death is the only wise advisor that we have. Whenever you feel, as you always do, that everything is going wrong and you're about to be annihilated, turn to your death and ask if that is so. Your death will tell you that you're wrong, that nothing really matters outside its touch. Your death will tell you, I haven't touched you yet." He shook his head and seemed to be waiting for my reply. I had none. My thoughts were running rampant. He had delivered a staggering blow to my egotism. The pettiness of being annoyed with him was monstrous in the light of my death. I had the feeling he was fully aware of my change of mood. He had turned the tide in his favor. He smiled and began to hum a Mexican tune. "Yes," he said softly after a long pause. "One of us here has to change, and fast. One of us here has to learn again that death is the hunter, and that it is always to one's left. One of us here has to ask death's advice and drop the cursed pettiness that belongs to men that live their lives as if death will never tap them." We remained quiet for more than an hour, then we started walking again. We meandered in the desert chaparral for hours. I did not ask him if there was any purpose to it, it did not matter. Somehow he had made me recapture an old feeling, something I had quite forgotten. The sheer joy of just moving around without attaching any intellectual purpose to it. I wanted him to let me catch a glimpse of whatever I had seen on the boulder. "Let me see that shadow again," I said. "You mean your death, don't you?" he replied with a touch of irony in his voice. For a moment I felt reluctant to voice it. "Yes," I finally said. "Let me see my death once again." "Not now," he said. "You're too solid." "I beg your pardon?" He began to laugh, and for some unknown reason his laughter was no longer offensive and insidious, as it had been in the past. I did not think that it was different, from the point of view of its pitch, or its loudness, or the spirit of it. The new element was my mood. In view of my impending death, my fears and annoyance were nonsense. "Let me talk to plants then," I said. He roared with laughter. "You're too good now," he said, still laughing. "You go from one extreme to the other. Be still. There is no need to talk to plants unless you want to know their secrets, and for that you need the most unbending intent. So save your good wishes. There is no need to see your death either. It is sufficient that you feel its presence around you.